Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. It is a true pleasure to be able to host you, and I think this conversation with Christina Hoff Sommers will be fantastic. We're going to get a lot out of it. As Dwight mentioned, intellectual takeout, we have a exceedingly sizable audience, particularly on social media, but also through email and other sources. We're beginning to do programs like this as well, so you'll be seeing more of that and taking joy in doing that. As for the topic, why this war on men? You think Weinstein, terrible guy, Halperin, we find out. Bill O'Reilly settles a sexual harassment suit for, I think, $32 million. So why a war on men? Doesn't it seem that there's a war on women taking place? Here at Intellectual Takeout, we pursue discourse. It means you look around at the political world today, cultural, everything. So many people just talk at each other. And I'm sure you've probably experienced that, where it's just, hey, this is how I am, da-da-da-da-da, and there isn't much movement. In fact, people just sort of fall back into their little, various blocks of friends and really just talking to themselves amongst it. But on Intellectual Takeout, we pride ourselves on discourse, our tone and tenor. We actually read the comments that people write. And there have been quite a few times where there have been formative changes made to Intellectual Takeout based on the patterns we're seeing in responses. You're looking at, it's the strangest thing. You start out, you're building an audience. We purposely built a diverse audience. We actually had a company come in a few years back. They went through and matched our audience to voter databases. They found 60% of the audience was registered as a Democrat or an independent. And it reflected what we saw. We saw a very balanced audience, but a lot of arguments and discourse coming in from different sides, and often unpolitical. But what you saw in the comments was actually exceedingly revealing, and it has driven us to go deeper into the cultural issues, less about politics, but actually much more meaningful things about how we live our day-to-day lives. We find ourselves talking about friendship, family, the role of fathers, anxiety. You wouldn't expect that from where we were when we were founded in 2009, but it's because of our discourse with our audience, that back and forth. To the point of why men and what is happening out there. One of the moments that I'll never forget for Intellectual Takeout, it was Valentine's Day a couple years ago. And if you're running a social media page, we do about 8 to 10 articles per day that we publish, 2,000 articles a year, constantly just cranking out material. But you also are doing 10, 12, 15 posts to social media each day as well. And so you're hungry for content. You also, if you want to have high standards, you're looking for good content. What do we do? Well, it was Valentine's Day. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis, good author, very thoughtful man when it came to the 20th century and what was happening and changing. It was Valentine's morning. I said, okay, we need some posts. Picked out the 4 loves. Let's just do that. We'll chop up the 4 loves, post them out there, and see how it goes. Well, we did the one on friendship and trimmed it down. It was a longer piece by C.S. Lewis, but it's very good. It's about this loss of friendship that's taken place. We post it. Thing takes off. And it's just, wow, that's amazing. And when you're running social media, you know when something's doing well, when it's not. The likes just go through the roof, as well as the shares. And I'm watching this all happen in real time. And then there are a couple of comments. But I click on, from our side, we can see, if we click on likes, we can see everybody who has public information, or is publicly sharing things. And so you can read what they're saying when they share documents. It's probably horrifying to everybody to know this, but that's how it all works. And you can see the likes as well and the shares. And I was dumbstruck. Couldn't believe it. We're up maybe 2 minutes and the thing's rocketing through. And it's all young men liking it. And it was all young men sharing it. And then it was just young men commenting. I kid you not. Our biggest cohort for the audience is the 18 to 24-year-old male, followed by 18 to 24-year-old female. But I was dumbstruck. Here we are, Valentine's Day, and it's a post on friendship. I mean, really, the BFF hearts connecting, I was expecting that, not men. What's fascinating about it is when you look at what C.S. Lewis actually wrote, and ladies, forgive me, but he never wrote about female friendship. He even admits, I don't know how that works, so be it. It's rather humorous, his take. But he writes about male friendship. And he specifically writes about how male friendship has been basically destroyed in the 20th century, and that there's this hole in man and young men, that we don't have friends, we don't have close bonds anymore to each other, and that there's this need for a male friendship, a companion. And a lot of people turn and they look at history now and they say, oh, look, Jonathan and David of the Bible, they were so close they even kissed each other on the cheek, they're gay. Well, that's not actually necessarily how it was. Men used to actually have these very deep, good relationships with their friends. But over and over in the comments and the shares, it was said, I wish I had this. Why don't we have this? And you see something missing. And there have been any number of other subjects that we've hit upon, but we see this missing thing. And you'll see it too if you talk about fatherhood. You'll see guys who had a good dad, maybe he passed away recently, and they'll say, oh, I miss my dad so much. He formed me. He just guided me. He was like my rock. And you'll see other guys who say, I never had a dad. I wish I had that. And so again, coming back to the war on men, it's not so much that we want to see these barbarians like Weinstein, but rather that it's the gentleman that's been gone and erased. And you see it in the young men as they comment on things, that they seem to feel as if they are pushed, if they want to be a man, a good man, an honorable man, that they're pushed to the fringe of society, that society no longer wants that. And to come back to C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man, he writes about this, the foolhardiness of it, and that we want things like honor. We want things like dignity. We want good men out there who are protecting or watching out over their families, over society, who are suffering on behalf, who are willing to carry that burden. But we laugh at it. And if you think about that, where in our society do we celebrate these things that we would normally attribute to a good man? And he says in doing that, we've created men without chests, that they're lacking something. They have their instinct, their male instinct, but what we really want, we laughed at and threw it away. And now we're suffering the consequences. And I think of men like Weinstein and others, men without chests who just follow their passions, their appetite. And what a shame that is. And so, again, we decided this is a topic that we should hit. We should bring in people. We found the response was fascinating. Most men didn't even respond. It's not normal. When we send out emails, we get responses, things like that. The guys on staff, sending it out to their, groups, male Bible study group or whatever, their drinking buddies, no response. There was neither a no, that's dumb, nor a yes, I'm coming. It was as if the question was never asked and they didn't want to actually have to deal with it. Whereas when we asked our wives to talk to people, the wives actually, all of a sudden, were bringing lots of friends. So there's something there. There is something in our society that we've managed to destroy what the gentleman is. And with that, I'd like to bring on Christina Hoff Sommers. She is an amazing, talented person. In fact, Christina just told me she has almost 200,000 followers on Twitter. So get on Twitter, bump her over the 200,000. So she's an amazing individual. You know from her videos, The Factual Feminist, some of them get up to 1 million views. She's touching a nerve when she talks about issues of men and feminism and what's happening in our culture. Christina currently is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, conservative think tank. She is known for her critique of contemporary feminism. Her works include Who Stole Feminism and the War Against Boys. Her writing has been featured in a variety of different media outlets, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and of course videos and other places all throughout the internet. She's also a philosopher, which is perhaps my favorite thing about her. Somebody who's actually willing to think deeply about these things and to pursue truth. And so with that, I'll join Christina, and maybe we could have a good conversation.
Yes.
Everybody, in your programs, you will see that there is a number there. So rather than doing the traditional, what you didn't hold on to your question and hope you remember it, just text your questions. They'll be coming to me here. And so as we talk, we'll also be fielding questions from the audience. So with that, we'll get started.
Welcome.
Well, to begin, Christina, could you tell us, truly about yourself? Why a person who carries the label feminist, which has so many different meanings these days, why would you decide to take up the issue of boys, particularly, and their needs? Could you give us that background, how you came to that path and what you saw, the reason for it?
Yes, well, my first book was, it came out in '94. It was called Who Stole Feminism? Because at the time I was very concerned that a movement I loved and was very proud of, I saw that in the academy, it was being taken in strange directions. And just to give an example, I remember I was reviewing a set of textbooks because the chair of my department wanted me to teach feminist theory. And in one of them, it was dedicated to this feminist author. She was a philosopher. She said, "This book is dedicated to the women in my women's studies ovular in the spring of '91 or something." And I hadn't heard the word ovular, and I was about to look it up. And then I realized I wouldn't find it. She made it up. She did not like the word seminar. So she replaced it with what she took to be the feminist. Don't think about it. But she wasn't kidding. It was funny, but she was very serious. And I mean, that's just one example. But these books were eccentric. The movement was, rather than being continuous with the Enlightenment tradition and classical liberalism, it had gone off in all sorts of exotic directions. And I found that it was buttressed by a lot of misinformation, false statistics, and sort of gender propaganda. And I don't think that women are helped by misinformation. I think we need good data and a good understanding to solve problems and not hype and spin and hyperbole. So in that book, I tried to correct the misinformation as best I could. And the area where I found the most confusion and the most misleading information was about girls and boys in school. Because at that time, by the time I wrote the second book, The War on Boys, girls had moved ahead of boys in ways which were unprecedented. Getting, much more likely to get better, good grades, winning the honors, and going to college. College matriculation rates every year were better and better for girls, and the boys weren't keeping up. And there was one education researcher who was looking at the projections into 2030 or something, and he said, by the middle, I think he said by 2044, the last man will graduate from college. Now, he was being facetious, but there was some truth to this, and yet I heard groups like the American Association of University Women, and the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where Carol Gilligan was there, they were all talking about the misfortunes of girls at a time where the well-being of girls across all ethnic groups, the girls were soaring ahead of their brothers. So the War Against Boys it was a book about what I had discovered, just this amazing amount of misinformation that I thought was harmful to everyone. Because if boys are in trouble, so are girls. These are the people with whom our kids, our sons and our daughters will build a future. And so I thought I should say something, and I did.
Definitely should. And to think that was published in 2000, correct?
Yeah, well, then I did an update
a
couple of years ago. So if you buy the book, make sure you get the second edition. It's very confusing on Amazon. People look for the book and they still trying to sell the old edition, but make sure you get the second edition.
I have the second edition. It's quite good.
It's
I like
better.
the updates. And you hit a point. I mean, when we talk about this situation of men and boys, we see comments quite a bit about there are no good men, or the issue of so many ladies who are, have a good income, have a good education, they may even have a master's or a PhD, but there aren't that many men out there to be able to find as far as raising a family or things of this nature. 2017, almost 20 years later, where do you see this going? I mean, how long does this trend go until, do men step in? Do ladies step in? Do they give up? What happens?
Well, that's a very good question. There is a similar phenomenon in Great Britain and Canada, Australia. They have a problem with educating boys, and they're falling behind. And in England, for example, it's treated as a kind of national crisis, particularly male literacy. There's an effort at the highest level of government to find out what are our schools doing wrong, how can we get boys to read, how can we keep them engaged in learning. And so you see in England, and you see, as I said, Canada, Australia, efforts to engage boys. What do you see in the United States? There's nothing. I mean, that's not to say there aren't, individual school systems that are making an effort, and a lot of teachers will try, but the schools of education, it's as if the problem doesn't exist.
Why is that? Why would, if we consider ourselves to be part of a similar civilization, similar background, particularly with the United Kingdom and that special relationship that we have, why have they turned this way and started to acknowledge these issues, whereas in America we are just going right down the trail as fast as we can?
Yeah, well, I think that in the United States we have a very strong women's movement for a good reason. The system was rigged against women. There were so many obstacles to women's ability to flourish and get an education and enter the workplace. So we built up a vast network of women's groups that did important and groundbreaking work, like the American Association of University Women, of making it better for women. And I think at a certain point, if you brought up boys, it was thought to be a backlash. And I remember one person said to me, why should I, this was actually a professor at the University of Maine, I think it was a debate, and she said, for centuries women have been behind, and now maybe it's just, and girls were left behind, now maybe it's just boys' turn to be left behind. And my answer to that is, why leave anybody behind? I mean, I did not like male chauvinism and became a feminist in college. But the answer to male chauvinism is not female chauvinism. The answer to misogyny is not misandry. And there were a lot of excellent efforts to strengthen girls in math and science. These are ongoing. There were massive amounts of resources to strengthen girls academically. Where were the programs for boys in areas where they were behind? Reading and writing. I didn't even talk about writing. I mean, the average 17-year-old boy, according to the Department of Education data, is about 2 years behind the girl in writing and 1.5 years behind in reading. Where are programs these are basic skills, entry, sort of fundamental to success in a knowledge-based economy. There was a time, people say to me, well, boys were never that interested in school. That's true. It's always been a struggle to educate little boys. But it was never more important for a young person to graduate from high school and get some education beyond high school, preferably college, or certainly an AA degree, 2-year degree, preferably a BA. There was a time you could make it into the middle class. If you just graduated high school and worked hard, you could have a family, you could have a house. This is no longer true. You must have, it's now some researchers at Brookings and the Harvard Graduate School of Education said that education beyond high school is the passport to the American dream. And as they point out, more and more young women are getting it, and young men are not.
What you describe as far as and I'm sure a fair amount of young men might feel the same as well, and I've watched, actually, stayed completely out of it, but you'll see these, debates between women as far as feminism or stay-at-home mom versus working mom, and you definitely stay out of those because it gets fierce really quickly.
You'll be a mansplainer. We don't
yes,
like that.
I don't need that. But so when you look at that, has feminism taken a turn to no longer seeking equality, but rather supremacy of the woman? And if that's the case, or pointing these things out, how has the response been to you personally if you're saying, wait a minute, let's aim back more for the equality, if that's the case?
Well, I have a lot of allies, and but not so much in the academy. A lot of just women, professional women, and they're concerned, especially if they have sons. Mothers of sons are some of my greatest allies because they know exactly what I'm talking about. But the response, as I said, it's many people were very angry about the book, The War Against Boys, and thought it was part of a backlash against girls. And the more I would try to tell them that I don't want to take anything away from the girls. I was a girl. I am a female.
Right.
I don't want to take anything away. I just want to do the same for boys. What we did for girls, let's do it. Let's try it with the boys. We have strengthened girls. We've shown them the importance of education. And we have evidence that teachers talk to girls more about the importance of education. Their parents talk to them more. And a lot of people just think, the boys will figure it out. They don't. Increasingly, they don't.
When you talk quite a bit about, these disparities between boys and girls in the classroom, as college going on for education. What do you see as driving it, as well as what changes have you seen, that fostered this shift and this emphasis towards helping the girls and sort of leaving the boys behind? I know there are probably plenty of parents here too that would be, have either dealt with this or concerned about it, and probably some young men who may feel that they've experienced this sort of thing.
Well, as many parents will know, and what I'm saying isn't true of all children. I'm speaking about, the norm. And the norm, typically, a little boy, at the beginning, as early as kindergarten, it's harder for him to sit still. And boys are more rambunctious. They're more risk-taking. They're troublemaking, and they engage in what rough and tumble play. Now, girls do that too. I liked to rough and tumble when I was 5, or even now I like it. But girls also engage in a lot of theatrical, imaginative play, playing house, playing school, or that best friend relationship, exchanging confidences, and so. Boys don't do that so much. They given the chance, they want that large motor, rough and tumble with sound effects, bam, boom, and increasingly parents and teachers are seeing this healthy, natural play of little boys as violence. And experts on playground dynamics, like I think it's Anthony Pellegrini at the University of Minnesota, he said it's very important to make a distinction between violence and rough and tumble play. And the difference is that when typically boys are doing that, they're usually smiling, they're very happy. You just want to keep doing it. They part as friends. It's normative, it's healthy, they're learning limits and all sorts of things. In aggression and violence, there's unhappiness, they part as enemies. These boys are usually not popular, they're bullies. It's very different. The other kind of play, the rough and tumble, is critical to their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and if we keep cutting back on recess, or we have more playgrounds where there's no running and no jumping, the games that boys like to play, typically, what we're doing is moving away from the needs of boys and then making them feel that there's something wrong with them. So we have little boys, these are extreme cases, but there are a lot of these cases you hear, it's almost always a little boy who's suspended from school. there was a kid in Maryland who, a 5-year-old, or maybe he was 6, he chewed a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, and he was suspended.
I remember that one. We wrote about it.
The story that I found so distressing was a father was called to school for a 7-year-old boy named Justin. This was in California. The teacher was very concerned about Justin. And he was a good boy. He'd never had any trouble. And both parents came to this parent-teacher conference, and she showed him Justin's drawings. The kids were supposed to make drawings and then write stories. Well, Justin had drawn pirates with swords, and there were some decapitated heads. And the teacher thought he was maybe a troubled
He's a serial murderer.
I'm a serial
just
killer.
Ready to go.
And the father said, but he likes pirate stories, and that's what and then the father said something to me that's very poignant. He said, how can a teacher that has so little sympathetic with my son's imagination, how will she be able to teach him? And that's what I worry about. And I don't see I don't see evidence that in our schools of education, there's much time spent addressing what it means to educate a Justin.
There are any number of questions that that point raises, but it's quite good. So I have 2 boys, and they are rough and tumble. And so one of my boys, he had some rash or something, not a bad type of thing, but we went to a specialist, and he brought along a Star Wars plastic, starship, whatever. And the male doctor freaked out. I mean, could you not? It was, why would you let him play with that? It is so sharp. And then, he could do damage. He could do this. You need to give him one of these, a DS. That is safe.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's what my wife calls me in tears. I just got chewed out by, and I kid you not, the next time they were roughhousing, and I don't know if they were playing some forbidden game like Cowboys and Indians or whatever, but one of them charged, and the other took the remains of a plastic gun and went pop right into his forehead, bleeding. And we had to go in to see that same doctor as the Foley. And I'll never forget, I'm lecturing him. He's just a kid at the time. I'm like, look, do not bring, the doctor's going to ask, just you're roughhousing. Don't say you got hit in the head with a gun. Not a real gun. But you can imagine how quickly the things went sour for me. What happened to your head? Oh, my brother hit me in the face with a gun. Oh.
But I mean, only
and you're waiting for Child Protective Services to show up.
Well, I know,
whatever.
but there's just more and more, interpreting the things the child does in the worst possible scenario. Yes. And my son, when this was a few years ago, he graduated. He was a senior in high school, and they went camping in the desert. And the creative writing facilitator or something came to the camp. I mean, he told me he loved the camp, but he said, there was one thing I didn't really like. This creative writing teacher came, and each child was given a notebook, some matches, a candle, and a pencil, and just told to disperse a little bit into the desert and find themselves. And so the girls did as they were told. They dispersed and began recording, sensitive musings about the desert. And the boys, without anybody saying anything, they kind of got together, threw the notebooks and pencils into a pile, and lit a bonfire. And
they found themselves, right? Yes.
And I know the creative writing teacher was so distraught, and she thought that they were proto-arsonists, sociopaths, and they were just boys. And and the assignment. Well, anyway, I just see, I hear these things, and then people, of course, tell me these stories, and then I followed it to the theories and the literature coming from schools of education, and that the attitude that she had, even giving that assignment, I found two wonderful psychologists, one at the University of Maine, talking about why boys may not be writing so well and why they are reluctant readers. And she has a theory that, and it's very speculative, but she went into classrooms and recorded young kids, 4 and 5, and how often does the teacher correct them and redirect their play? And it doesn't happen that much to girls, but she noticed the boys were all day long, constantly being redirected, usually away from, sword fights or rough and tumble thing, back to writing about a monster destroying a city. Let's rethink that a little bit into more positive ways. And what worried these researchers is they said, play is the basis for learning. And if at the earliest age, the things you like to play are usually things you want to write about. You put pen to paper and you want to continue these fantasies. And she asked if we're constantly showing disapproval and of your imagination, disapproval of what your preferences, this may be playing a role in boys' antipathy to school and to seeing books and, identifying them more as for girls. And I thought that was a very good question. Unfortunately, we don't have a research community right now that's pursuing these questions. So I'm hoping that changes.
Yeah. You have spoken about the Google situation as far as the Google memo and detailing, this thing or that as far as a very engineer approach to somewhat of a different nature, if you will. How much, when we talk about this, I think we both recognize, okay, they're the boys, rough and tumble, they're my girls doing this and that, and I'm not coaching them, but do we have a sort of a fundamental philosophical problem in the sense that we want to see that there is no nature, that they're blank slates in many ways, a sort of romanticism, and that society is putting these things on? But if they actually do have a certain nature, is that an allowable topic in academia, and would it be wiser to then shape education towards that nature, but directing it sort of to the good, the true, and the beautiful, if you will, but for each? What do you see, and it's a touchy topic, gentle one to bring up, but is that worth considering?
Well, what's worth considering is that there is a difference between, conventional male and female behavior. There are differences this shows up everywhere, even studies of male and female vervet monkeys and rhesus monkeys. The way the play patterns are very much like they are for males and females, so I'm not sure that vervet monkeys were subject to a social construction of a gender binary. The females tend towards the dolly, kind of the baby playing with a doll, and the boys towards a gadget or a wheeled toy. And we have a lot of literature just about, we know that girls begin to read at a younger age. They have better verbal skills. You ask a little girl to generate synonyms, she'll do better than a boy. Boys, on the other hand, typically have better spatial reasoning skills. And this is one of the best, established difference. It's true cross-culturally, and I don't think there's anyone that would seriously doubt that. What most people will tell you correctly is that the gender difference is a combination, and we don't know. It's not well understood. But it's it's both culture and biology. But the biology is there. And to completely deny it, I think people have good intentions and they think, well, particularly women, have been harmed by gender stereotypes, and there is a terrible history of saying, sweeping generalizations about women that implied our inferiority. You go, and especially in my field of philosophy, some of the worst possible things were said by
Nietzsche, I believe.
Nietzsche, my goodness, who, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, was probably terrified of women. But he had, yes, he thought that, he said, a woman with any serious, if you meet a woman and she has serious intellectual interests, she probably has sexual problems, And Immanuel Kant thought that women weren't capable of rational decision-making, and therefore couldn't really be held to the same moral standards, because just too irrational and too easily distracted by the lovely and the beautiful and the charming, and not the true and the rational. So we've got that to contend with. So I know that when you talk about sex differences, you have to be a lot more careful than James Damore was at Google. He just kind of put it all out there.
It was a very engineer approach.
Yes. And I made a video about it, and I did say, he might not have wanted to do it that way. And here's the point that I think he maybe would have been better had he made. There are these differences, particularly when it comes to having a career in computer science. We know that there does seem to be in far more women are interested in fields that engage them as caregivers and nurturers. We have far more women, social workers, psychologists, nurses, and you do find more men in the people-free zones, working as just with machinery, and and they'll ask people. We have a lot of very good data on vocational interests. You go into a counselor, what do you want to be? And you take a test, and one of the things they might ask you is, would you rather sit down with a person and help them solve their problems, or would you rather take a machine apart and put it back together? And you find just far more women than men say they would want to help the person, and far more men say they would want to work with the machine. So it may have something to do with our biology. I mean, and I think society can, intensify those tendencies. So I'm very much in favor of schools, finding a way to and parents to make your boy a little more nurturing, make your daughter a little more of an engineer. But the child will have his or her own ideas about it, and you leave kids to their own. And even though we've had at least 15 to 20 years of activism around getting more women in math, and women do go into math, but engineering and computer science, they don't. I mean, it's something. Even now, if you look at the people getting engineering degrees, it's so over 70% men. It's computer science, it's something like 80%. So, and it hasn't changed very much. Now, I don't say that it won't, and I wish it would. At the same time, though, you have schools, psychology, graduate programs, the most elite graduate programs are mostly women. It didn't used to be the case. Veterinary medicine, it was an all-male field. As soon as those doors came down, women went in and left men in the dust in terms of going to the best vet schools and so forth. So with a lot of freedom and education and encouragement, it's still not the case that men and women are making the same choices. So anyway, to get back to James Damore, what I thought he left out, though, is that even though there may be an explanation of why you probably have to have had a degree in engineering or computer science to work in Silicon Valley or to work at Google, that doesn't mean that the women that are there, because you still have the 20% of women that have those degrees. You have more women with engineering degrees who will be there, and there could still be a bro culture. It could still be hard, and he could have admitted that a little more. I mean, he did. In fairness, it was very long, and he sort of covered all the bases. But the fact that he did that, and the reaction was just fire him, and he was excommunicated, rather than use it as an occasion he could have brought men and women together to talk about it. And it could have been a good occasion for communication rather than denigration and silencing and going the way of our colleges and universities, where people are silenced all the time for what they say.
Well, and that actually, I'd like to, at a certain point, touch upon fathers and sort of male role models or the male identity and what might be aimed for. But on that point, why is there this sort of fragility to, I mean, one guy, an engineer, puts out a report and it's national news, and to your point, fire him. Is it the fear that, oh, we're getting the backlash of boys, or is there actually more of an uncertainty there in the sense where there's a concern that nature may actually upend certain ideological beliefs or goals?
Yeah, Mother Nature may not be a feminist. It may be very hard to re-engineer human nature. The fact that cross-culturally, there's never been a society in the entire anthropological record where the men were the nurturers and the women were the warriors and the engineers, and we just haven't had that. I have to be careful to say that as many as 20% of men or women will defy the stereotype. So you have to have a fair and open society to let, I guess I would call them outliers. There are a lot of women who are brilliant engineers and who would want to take apart the machine, would think it was horrible to sit and talk about somebody's problems, and would much, prefer. So we have to be open about that. Yeah. But then, and that is the feminist in me. I don't want any obstacles. In the bad old days, that woman couldn't get that job at all. Now it's sort of moved, well, why isn't it 50%? And that's where I think that's an unreasonable expectation. I think what you want is equality of opportunity, do as much as you can, and certainly encourage young women in the early grades and make this world interesting to them as you can, while helping boys with their reading and writing.
Yeah, it seems that the equality of opportunity has morphed into a desire for equality of ends, that these things come out, and an uncomfortableness. To your point, I always think it's humorous. My oldest daughter is the one who actually is most likely, if I'm working on something, building something, she wants to come out and use the drill and do these things. And I love it. I want her to know how to do these sorts of things. To your point, when just circling back as far as your perception of feminism, and we've gotten a few questions of ladies asking, in agreement where, let us remove these barriers and have it a free and fair, competition, but nature may lead to very different paths, and so be it. But as long as those barriers aren't there, but what label would you offer up? Would you say to the ladies in the audience who are asking, who share more of your views, that, do I call myself a feminist, or is there something else? I mean, the whole man's desire for nomenclature and categories and all of that kicks in. We want to be able to identify with something, but it seems that there's a fear of identifying with what is becoming more and more radicalized. Right.
Well, they do polls. Could be the Gallup poll, or there was recently a U.gov poll, and they asked people, are you a feminist? And over again, we get about the same result. Most people say no. I think in this one, maybe 25% said yes, and the rest of the people said no. And then they asked the people, well, why not? And the number one answer was, it's too radical, too extreme. And so here we have a movement that is one of the great chapters in the history of human freedom. I mean, the women's movement. And you would think people would be proud of that movement and all women would identify with it, but they don't. And I think, and this makes feminists very mad because in the feminist establishment, because they'll say, pollsters will ask the same people, well, do you believe in equality? Do you believe in equal pay for equal work? Do you believe in, equal rights? And they'll say, oh, of course, yes, high 90s. But they won't call themselves a feminist. And I want to sort of raise my hand and say, well, you're my kind of feminist. If you believe in equality of opportunity and equality before the law, I call that an equity feminist, or an equality feminist. And that is the the style of feminism that freed women. It informed the first wave. It came out of the European Enlightenment and driven by, great feminist foremothers like Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century and the male, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, in the 19th, as philosophers, and then, Susan B. Anthony and the suffragists. And it was also equity feminists that informed a lot of the important legislative breakthroughs in the 1960s and Supreme Court rulings. Those were moderate, sort of liberal feminists, and both Republicans and Democrats on the court and in Congress. So that tradition, I think, is very powerful. But if you were to take a typical gender studies class today, that tradition is held with disdain. They say, oh, it was racist and classist and, it just served the purposes of upper middle class elite women. And the students are taught to look down on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And they had some personal failings when it came to poor people and women of color. They were not perfect, but they did so much that has changed the lives of all women, because being able to vote, that's not just for white elite women or the second wave of feminism, having opportunities, and I go to international women's conferences, I meet women from all different countries. This is the kind of feminism that inspires them. That's what they want. The feminists that I met from Egypt or from Somalia, Cambodia, that's the tradition. But that tradition, when I wrote the book, Who Stole Feminism, a group of far more radical women ran off with the movement and took the name, and now people say, well, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in equality.
Revolutions, sometimes tend to eat their own in some sense, which is what you're describing, which is a shame. How, when we look at things dividing as well into gender identity and this and that, you made an interesting comment when John Miltimore, one of our senior editor, asked you about men standing up for themselves, if you will, or coming together to defend boys and things like that. You said it wasn't likely, that moms were the ones to be more likely doing that. So in some sense, would you say there probably would never be a sort of a counter to the feminist side, a sort of, Meninists, something of that sort?
They've tried. And there is a group that organized around men's health issues, and that's the most successful effort.
So they want me to go to the doctor?
Yeah.
No.
And because men don't go unless their wives make them.
That's true.
And there's men's health is, there was just Columbia University Hospital just did a study about men and when they go to the doctor, and there are just vast numbers of men who have no contact with the medical establishment at all until they get their first heart attack or something. So, but if you go to the CDC, the website of the CDC, there's vast amount of literature, on women's health and men's health, not much. Finally, they did put up a page on the women's health page. They put something about men, and but men, they die earlier and get, a lot of deadly diseases earlier than women, and are, need to see doctors and get attention and medical. So that's a whole other issue. But that's been the most successful. But I think I actually heard, I think it was Warren Farrell once point out, and he used to be a feminist, then he became a men's rights activist, and he thinks that there may be we're just wired we want to think of men in a certain way, and so the idea that men could be at risk. Or that, could be fragile in any way is something men aren't going to admit to, and it makes the whole society nervous, so we're not going to talk about it. So a lot of men's problems go undiscussed, unaware. And but if you're a mom and you have sons, then they have problems and they need attention as much as a daughter.
And on that note, there are a couple issues that I can think of. For instance, we did, a few years back, Intellectual Takeout did a Freedom of Information request to the Department of Health of Minnesota. And we wanted to know the out-of-wedlock birth rates broken out by race, and we even had it broken out so that it would be immigrant versus non-immigrant, particularly relevant for the African American community. And we did it for St. Paul proper, and then Ramsey County, and then we did it for Minneapolis, and then Hennepin County, the two counties that they rest in. And the numbers were horrifying, to say the least. Over the 5-year period that we had, which concluded, I think, in 2014, you had almost a 90% out-of-wedlock birth rate for native-born African Americans in St. Paul. Other ethnicities, 40, 50%, 30%, and the numbers are huge. When we look at that, for boys, who do they have as an example? I've gotten quite a few questions from the audience, asking about men. They sense that in advertisements, the father's usually a buffoon, that in sitcoms, the one person who's an idiot is the dad. He's clumsy, he doesn't know anything, he needs help. What would a male identity look like, I guess, if we were to talk in such terms? But also, how do we turn this around? What can...
Well, first you brought up the little boys without fathers.
Yes, we'll start with that. I mean, both of these are all cans of worms,
right.
all over the place.
It's in Washington, D.C., this, in fact, was at my institute. So some of the scholars got together with more liberal scholars from Brookings Institute to get together to talk about policies that they could endorse together. Something that Republicans and Democrats could work on. Let's find common ground, because we all know there's a lot of division in Washington, but this was an occasion for common ground. And they came together and they determined that the most radical and effective change would be for the government and society in general to start encouraging family stability. The way we sort of changed attitudes about smoking, or, we got people to wear seatbelts. Maybe we should encourage people to get married before they have kids, and stay married if possible. And the reason is because the data is just, and no Democrat could look at it, no Republican could not see it.
Yep.
And the interesting thing is the different effects on boys and girls. Because one thing they've noticed is from, economically strapped families, a single mom, a boy and a girl, the girl looks up to her mother, and she sees, a strong person, because usually it's the father who will have left the home, and the kids are with the mother, typically. And so they have a role model in the mom. A boy, he loves his mom, but it's not exactly the role model. And they tend to get the role model. A lot of these boys are fine, and I've, in my own family, have nephews that were raised without a father, and they did fine, but somebody was there as the father figure, some male they could identify with. If they don't have that, then they tend to find it with their friends, who aren't always the best models. If you're lucky, they have, exemplary friends, but typically that's not the case. And what they think is that we now have a culture of fatherlessness. We have single-parent families, and it may be dysfunctional, and it may have a disparate impact on boys.
Yeah, it's interesting when we share some of that data, the responses that we often get, it's quite fascinating. We will you'll see occasionally single moms coming on, but also a lot of millennials who, don't have a family, they're single right now, they're just living life. But their response is quite often, and I see it over and over, is children it doesn't matter if the father's in the house. Children only need one adult who loves them. Doesn't necessarily have to be a mother or a father. And it's fascinating because what I have started to see too is that a generation of younger men seem to be pushing back on this, and I've watched it, where they come in and I mean, I remember one clear as day, you sound just like my mother. And now that I'm 30 or so and I've got a family, I completely see what I lost out on not having a father. And, I personally, I was raised by a single mom. She worked exceedingly hard, cleaned houses even while I was in college, and she did wonderful things. Owe a lot to her as far as that fight, and I was an only child. But I was just asked, actually, just a few moments ago before coming on, it was, well, who did you look up to as a father figure? You had to have somebody. You have, 5 kids, and, who helped you? And I honestly cannot think of a single male father figure that ever influenced me, whether it's, certainly not on entertainment, but nobody else really in life either. And it seemed to be that the only thing that I could think of is what I didn't have, and to provide that. And so sort of an inversion and figuring that out. But when you have a 90% out of wedlock birth rate, even a 50%, a 30, 40%, you're getting really low on father figures that people can, that these boys can look up to. What do you see? It seems like we need to, if the numbers are true, and the data is overwhelming as far as boys without a father, but how do we do this? At that point, how do you come back from a 90, a 70%, even a 50% out of wedlock birth rate?
Well, one of the things you do is don't deny the problem. And, I really encourage anyone who is skeptical just to look at outcomes. And, what you can predict from family stability versus a single parent, just in terms of resources available to that child, in terms of, there's just so many metrics that it puts a kid at a serious disadvantage. In fact, there was one, he's a brilliant political scientist, Bill Walston, who said once, in the future, it's not going to be, the question isn't, the key thing isn't going to be like your race, the key thing isn't going to be your income level, but did you have a father or not? And we're just going to have a society where there'll be 2 Americas, and there are kids that are raised with 2-parent families, and kids with 1 parent, and it's also harder on that 1 parent. And so look, we want a society where people obviously don't want to stay in a miserable marriage, and it's not good for the children either. But where is the information? It's not getting through to people. They don't know. And if this is something you knew very early on, you better be very careful about who you marry. You better work very hard to keep that together, because if this falls apart, it's just, it undermines your child's basic stability in this world. And I just feel people don't know it. And sometimes, as you said, with millennials, I'm afraid to bring it up. When I go to colleges, they're already protesting. And if I mention this about fatherlessness, I did it at Stanford. And I was debating the wage gap, and everything was fine, and nobody minded what I said. And then I mentioned that, and then people were just furious that I would even suggest this. So they don't know, they just have not looked at the scholarship. And so we're going our merry way and pretending. And I don't know at what point people will think, oh, okay, that, may not have been a good idea. That we know right now we have a high percentage of young men who aren't working at all. There's the largest number of young men in their 20s and 30s. They're not unemployed because they're not looking for work.
They just quit.
Disengaged. A huge cohort of disengaged young men, and so that, as I said, it's not good for our economy. It's not good for the well-being of young women. You say that's hard to find good men. I still think there are a lot of good men out there, but it is hard to find, because the girls are doing better. They're stronger, they're career-driven, and you have a lot of boys who are not. And part of that is, I think, does have to do with what's happened with the families and in the schools. So we should at least try. If we find out there's nothing you can do about it, people don't want to be married, everybody's going to get divorced in the future, that's it. Okay, but I don't think we've even made an effort.
No, it seems, we've done a lot of work as far as pointing out some of the issues as far as, the depressingly low reading levels, for instance, of African American boys in 10th grade in the Minneapolis public school system. And we're talking maybe teens, maybe a quarter of them are reading at grade level. Just depressingly low numbers. And in my conversations with individuals who want to see change, oftentimes black men who are saying we've got to do something, the idea is raised of truly reforming the education system, but even having schools that are just for boys and have, I've got one friend, he is resist, eliminate, Trump is evil, this and that. But he also ran a charter school for quite a few years.
Right.
And it was a charter school, very diverse, and he found that, he called it sort of the new paternalism, that unfortunately to rebuild, you needed this sort of male role model, especially for the boys in these broken homes. As you say, I've seen it online, you've seen it definitely in giving speeches, but to move this needle, to have this discussion, it seems like it would be an enormous task, but one that's necessary.
Take what you said about the low reading scores of these boys. One of the best programs I ever heard of was tried out in West Virginia. And I think these were poor white boys, poor working class white boys who had like the lowest reading scores in the state, and that's West Virginia. That's saying a lot.
Yeah.
And the teacher, they brought in a program where and the girls were doing a little better, so they separated the kids, and this dynamo of a teacher came in, and she organized something called Battle of the Books, and it was a competition. And they had to read these books and then answer questions about them. And then I guess it was like a game show or something. And the boys really got into it. And then they got obsessed with it. They wanted extra books in the summer for the next year for their team. And she said it was the first time boys ever wanted to read books over the summer. And at a certain point, her 5th grade boys were beating the co-ed 8th grade class, or maybe it was the 7th grade class. They were beating kids older than them at reading. The ACLU came in because of I think it was the American Association of University Women, and some other groups thought that it was improper in the public school to have an all-boys class. The girls had another all-girls class, but they had separated them, even though the Department of Education had said it was okay because they know that there are kids who do benefit from these programs, girls with the math and science and boys with the reading. And they shut it down. They threatened a lawsuit, and they had to shut it down. And that, to me, was... I wanted to know what they were doing, and maybe it was something other teachers could use. Because even in a school with in a classroom with boys and girls, if teachers do both of these things, there are going to be girls that are more like the boys and boys that are... So all the kids will be helped by it. But we don't do that. And then we shut down a program, and it was because of gender politics, and because if you even want to talk about differences between boys and girls, people don't like to hear that. They want to say, oh, we're all the same, it's all socially constructed, and let's deconstruct it, re-engineer them. Well, I have not seen, people think, oh, we just get boys to play with dolls, and they'll be more like the girls, and we won't have these problems. There's no evidence that is going to work. You'll make boys feel worse about themselves and probably be worse readers if they have to, read books that, are chosen because the teacher thinks they're good at, re-engineering his psyche or something. So there we are. No solution and making the problem worse.
Yeah, it seems, as I consider this, you have 2 things that need to be taking place. One, and I'd love to get more advice from you on this for the parents out there, or guys and gals that can see themselves being parents down the road, which is just sort of this quiet effort to raise good men. despite the odds, but not popping your head up, not doing any of that, but it coming from the remaining strong families. The other side, though, it seems, as you describe these issues, we know that teachers go through colleges of education, they're funneled through higher ed. We look at where, various studies or these efforts are coming from. A lot of the trouble, or at least, this push, as some folks have asked, is it really a war? Well, there's not a shooting war, but there's certainly, it seems...
With boys, I would call it a war of attrition. It's just ignored them.
Fascinating.
And as far as a war in men, I wouldn't exactly, maybe a war against the gentleman, in the sense that it's not something, when I was writing The War Against Boys, I would ask young men from all different, I interviewed a lot of boys, and surfer dudes in California, and, working class boys in Pittsburgh, and some African-American boys in D.C., and young men in Georgetown at this high school. And I asked them, what is it, all of them, I asked them, what is it, what do you think of being a gentleman? And they all sort of thought that was a good thing. They didn't know exactly what it was when I asked them, what does a gentleman do? But they kind of thought something that was good. In fact, in one D.C. public school, they had a program, I haven't been able to find if it's continued, but they did have a program, it was something like, where they had a dance, and they taught the boys to, hold the door and the chair, and it was all of that. And the girls loved it. But just to reinforce sort of manners, because you see, we have this war of the sexes and men behaving abominably, but when you had manners, it's easier to do with manners, to cultivate goodness through manners than through law. When you do it with law, the law can't be there. You can't have a policeman there every minute making sure you're doing the right thing. But if people internalize a set of showing a certain respect to one another and deference, and it is a bedrock truth that on average a man can physically overpower a woman, a man can be a violent bully to a woman. Women have their ways of getting back, but physically men have the advantage. And there may be a reason why in a civilized society we might want to develop some sort of code of gallantry and showing respect. And I know in the 70s as a feminist, I thought a lot of these things were demeaning and condescending to women. I know we're not going to have codes of gallantry, but maybe we were too hasty to throw that out, and that there is value in this sort of decorum between the sexes. And, I read Jane Austen novels, I read Mr. Darcy. What has happened to that? Is it impossible that we can't have...
He was an amazing man. If I was a woman...
But there was Mr. Wickham. We still have the Wickhams in our these.
Yeah, what you describe is almost, if you roll back the clock, yes, problems as far as equal opportunity, but you also had very much of sort of, American Sniper's very popular, but you saw this discussion at Chris Kyle, if I recall correctly, name, the sheepdog versus the wolf. That the male, the strong male, is actually there somewhat of a protector of the family, of the children, of decency in society. I was struck again with Weinstein and all these other things going on, even the various allegations of corruption and collusion and this and that going on both sides of the aisle in D.C. Where are the people of virtue who stand up and say, what, this is wrong, I'm willing to walk for my job, or, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't seem to be happening. Do you see that as far as, if we're looking for people to be examples of the gentleman, doesn't seem like it would come from Hollywood. We have a lot of barbarians.
We've talked about, the fatherlessness, so there's not going to be any guidance there. And then we have the popular culture, what's going on in schools, where boys might just be defiant, and and if you threaten a young, you see, the thing about a code of a gentleman is it showed a model of manliness, which didn't mean you were going to become feminine or something. It wasn't you weren't teaching boys, well, you have to play with dolls, or you have to write, keep a journal about your feelings, or as my son was told, you're not asking to do that, but it's a way in which they can be manly, but without. It works. It's tried and true, not perfect, but better than what we have. And so I'm just, open to ideas like this. And I think it's some of my reading as a philosopher, and I like very much the philosopher Edmund Burke, who did write a lot about the importance of traditions of decency and cultivating practices and manners, and how if you didn't have the manners, and all you just have is raw human nature, and then the law coming in to police the defiant. He said that it doesn't work,
right?
And you just you'll have people being hauled off all the time when they get caught, and then the state of nature, of Hobbesian nature.
Well, and what you described two things, and we only have a little bit more time, but if we go down this road, and as you say, there's a 20% of the population coming out of good families who have a sense of security. I know coming out of broken homes, you're far more likely to have anxiety. There are a lot of,
you came. There are a lot of good.
Totally.
There are bad families that are intact, but it's just the odds, and just the it is just we've learned a little bit about a human society, and I know in the 60s. There was an experiment with communes, and people thought, oh, we'll just raise the kids, in this commune, there won't be any parents, and it did not work. There was a lot of abuse and anomie, all sorts of things. It was just like, whoa, we're not going to do that. We learned, and maybe some of them worked, but many of them were notoriously dangerous places for children. And I'm thinking, but we're going through this period where we think, okay, then kids can be raised without two parents.
Yeah, it seems as if we are, as a philosopher, does it sometimes seem like we're discovering what the past already knew in some ways?
Yes, I think it was Tom Wolfe, the great writer. He called it the great relearning. He said the great relearning is what has to happen when people get carried away with radical ideas and they go too far, they go to the brink, and then they realize, and he gave an example he said there were a group of hippies living in Haight-Ashbury.
Hippies.
And I was a flower child, not a hippie, so we took baths, but these were hippies. Hippies, flower children, and they were living, and they didn't believe in baths or washing. They thought that was bourgeois, and they got dirtier and dirtier, and they began. Tom Wolfe said they began to get diseases that were so old they hadn't even acquired. They just, you had to go back and find the Anglo-Saxon, scrotch and rot and I don't know, terrible things, and they rediscovered that they needed modern hygiene. They needed to bathe. They needed to wash their hair. And he thinks that we do that all the time. We go to the brink, and then and I think we might do that with men and women, the differences between the sexes. And I want to say it in a positive way, because the gender system, when it was enforced on everybody, where a woman was supposed to be feminine and have certain interests in men, no, we're not going to go back to that. And I think we needed, a reformation, we'll call that, where we opened up, and people who were different, if you were gay or you were trans or something, I see no reason why our society can't be accommodating to that. At the same time, though, you don't then turn around and become intolerant of the conventional. So I see, for example, people, it used to be the case if you had a child that was gender nonconforming, they would, try to do everything you can to get this girl to play like a girl, and now they advise against that. Just let her play the way she wants. I agree with that. and most child, experts. But also, if your child embodies traditional interests and preferences, then let them do that and not be disapproving. If your boy wants to play like a boy or your girl goes through an obsessive princess stage or something, you interfere when you have to always show them more possibilities, but don't try fundamentally, don't go too far in disapproving and if you're I wrote in the Who Stole Feminism about a group of feminist moms who had sons, and it didn't work out the way they thought. These boys, no matter what they did. I remember there was one mother, these were all women writers, and she had this little boy, and she said he was a natural-born hunter. And she would take him out to show him, let's photograph daffodils. And he would be getting bows and arrows, and nothing went the way. And she put him in a Montessori school on Cape Cod, and they were growing tomatoes on sticks, and he would get the sticks, and his friends would start sword fights, and that would cause a crisis. And finally, she said there was something about that school that did not honor his boy soul. So this feminist mom, realized he had a boy soul. He was in a conventional boy soul, to put it that way. And so she put him in a different school and, changed a little bit. And it's kind of what I want us to do. While accommodating the kids that are gender nonconforming, let's be kind and understanding and teach our kids to, get along and no more of this bullying. But at the same time, a certain respect for a tolerance of conventionally masculine or conventionally, not to pathologize. Just how we used to pathologize those who didn't conform, we are now really pathologizing conventional masculinity and even conventional femininity.
As far as, and we probably only have time for one more question, but a number of folks are asking, what could they do? If they sense this war of attrition, if you will, what do you see as the role of fathers, of mothers, of young men who are out there, even going into the working world, dating, things? What advice would you have to those who are concerned and would be allies of you?
Well, one of the things that I speak at a lot of colleges, and the good news that I have for students who are looking for, if they're going to grad school, it's always a problem, like, what should I do? What's the work to be done? There is so much work to be done in the area of male pedagogy and in also male psychology. The feminists pointed out correctly that a lot of medical, regimen used to be based on the, middle-aged male, and females were sort of an afterthought. I think that a lot of clinical psychology is based on a female that likes to sit and talk about her problems and work it out, and a lot of men don't want to do that. That's the last thing in the world. And psychologists in Australia have found that to help a lot of adolescent boys who are in trouble, we have troubles with male depression, male suicide, they realized it was not working to bring them in, and they've come up with apps, and they've learned that you don't say to an adolescent boy who's depressed, you don't say, oh, well, let's talk about your feelings. What you say, look, you've got a problem, we're going to solve it. And you engage like that male engineering, spirit to solve this problem. They've worked, it's just exciting to me that there's whole new domains of education opening up. Unfortunately, in gender studies, it's all captive to this tedious sort of Stalinist idea of just a patriarchal oppressor, male, female, when there's just this whole world. Just relax, get the politics out of it, bring back the science, bring an open mind. And you could really help people. And if you helped men and you help, figured out what makes families work, and we have a lot of intellectual firepower that's been, an energy that's been going into this politicized education. It's kind of out of control. We didn't even talk about politics in the university.
We need another hour or two.
But
so we'll bring
nevertheless, that's going nowhere fast, because sooner or later, how many schools can you have implode like Evergreen College? Right. And I think a lot of presidents looked at that. So if the departments begin to be a little more flexible and will allow this research, there are just whole areas that could open up and address the problems. But what we do now, I'm a writer. I don't lead a movement, and nobody would follow it, and I'm not doing that. But there are fatherhood groups. There are, as far as reforming education, my favorite is the Foundation for Intellectual Rights in Education. Fire. It's a bipartisan civil libertarian group sort of fighting the politicization of education, the rigid gender politics, opening up a little bit to more ideas. So I'm a big champion of FIRE and supporting programs like this.
Well, thank you. And I think that brings us about to our conclusion. I hope I got most of the answers or questions asked as far as what people were sending in. Thank you. There were actually a lot of questions, so very engaged. It was fun. My takeaway, it seems that, for parents, for fathers, it's just a quietly going along and trying to raise, this boy to be able to do it right. But it seems that a long march through higher education and the academy is necessary in the sense of people slowly getting in and actually, as you described, getting into the psychology area, discussing these things, and putting out the different ideas, and that's utterly
the great
fascinating.
relearning. I think we're getting close to realizing we're sort of like those hippies in San Francisco. We've gone a little too far with the politicized scholarship and the, not letting people speak. And even me, I get protested for saying the things I said here. And people say, that it's that that these ideas are violent. My views at Oberlin College were called violent.
I felt very threatened.
And yes, and the students needed a safe space. 30 young women fled to a safe room during my talk. I triggered a therapy dog that ran out. I was sorry about that. But anyway, this has been a great audience, and no triggered pets.
No. Our goal, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, to respect your time, I just would like to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really great to see you. We will have this on video, and sign up for our email list. Go on to Facebook, like Intellectual Takeout. Go on and help Christina get over 200,000 for Twitter as well.
C.H. Sommers.
There you go, and like the Factual Feminist. But we will getting this out. It'll also be a podcast and audio available too. So get it. If you like it, share it with your friends and others. Otherwise, thank you. Have a very wonderful night. And of course, if you do like Intellectual Takeout, can't help it. We're a nonprofit. There are envelopes in there if you'd like to support efforts like this and what we do online and fostering this actual rational discourse, the give and take of ideas that is such a beautiful tradition of the West that we do not want to end up going over the brink and losing it. So thank you. Have a safe drive home.